Hello and welcome to The Political Sphere, the show focusing on the biggest stories in politics in the last week. I'm Lawrence Jeffcoat and here are the biggest stories in politics in the last week. And firstly, in US political news this week, we saw the longest US government shutdown, which lasted 35 days, end. The president announced that the government would remain open until February the 15th, and the president is still standing by his promise to build a border wall on the southern border with Mexico, although right now there seems to be no agreement between the GOP and the Democrats as to what that plan would be and what it would entail. However, the president has stated now that the Mexican-US border wall that he wishes to build would not cover the full border, but rather be in predetermined high-risk locations. The non-partisan Congressional Budget Office has estimated the total cost to the US economy caused by the partial government shutdown is overall about $11 billion, with a reduced $3 billion in real GDP in the fourth quarter of 2018 and an estimated reduction of $8 billion in real GDP for the first quarter of 2019. The CBO believes the money lost in the fourth and first quarter will be recovered, with a total of $3 billion not being recovered. And also we saw that Nancy Pelosi had announced that the State of the Union would go forward, as now the government shutdown is over, with the date of the State of the Union now being February the 5th. And continuing with US political news now, we saw this weekend that Roger Stone was arrested at his Fort Lauderdale home in connection to the Mueller investigation. Mr. Stone was charged with giving false statement to the House Intelligence Committee, obstruction of an investigation, and witness tampering. The indictment documents discuss Mr. Stone's false testimony to the House Intelligence Committee and also his connections to WikiLeaks and about the information that he received in connection to the Clinton campaign during the 2016 election. Mr. Stone has made a career out of being a political consultant, mainly aligning himself with the Republican Party, which included advising the Trump campaign for a short period of time. Mr. Stone has since gone on many different networks, including ABC and Fox News, to give interviews after he was indicted. Both videos from ABC and Fox News can be seen in the description below, which I recommend that you do watch. Mr. Stone has since criticised the style in which he was arrested by the FBI, which included the FBI arresting him in full tactical gear early in the morning. Also, I have linked in the description below an article which includes the full indictment documents, which I recommend that you read over to see the full charges and also the descriptions of the relationships that Mr. Stone is accused of having. Mr. Stone has since pled not guilty to the charges. And lastly, in US political news this week, we saw that tech company Huawei was charged with stealing trade secrets and not abiding by US sanctions in Iran. In relation to stealing trade secrets, Huawei is accused of attempting to gain information on a robot which US telecom T-Mobile used to test their own phones in order to create their own robot. And in relation to not abiding by sanctions, Huawei had stated that they had sold their ownership in an Iranian company, but the US says that this claim is false. In a speech, Acting Attorney General Matthew Whitaker said that Huawei had potentially obstructed justice by lying to the federal government and by moving potential government witnesses back to China. The charges have come only weeks after Canadian officials arrested Huawei's chief financial officer, and the US had requested her extradition back to the US, and only a week after China had arrested an Australian writer. The charges against Huawei date back as far as 2007, and I have linked the full speech by Matthew Whitaker, the Acting Attorney General, in the description below so you can see what the specific charges are. And in Australian political news now, on the weekend we saw Nigel Scullion, the Indigenous Affairs Minister, become the third minister to quit from politics. Mr. Scullion will be leaving behind a 17-year career in the Senate. He also joins Human Services Minister Michael Keenan and Industrial Relations and Jobs Minister Kelly O'Dwyer in resigning from politics. The question now stands, though, how much strain will this put on the coalition before the next federal election? And speaking of former Liberal MPs, this week we saw Julia Banks, former Liberal MP and current Independent MP, announced that she would in fact contest the next election. However, she will not be contesting her seat of Chisholm, which she has held since 2016. Rather, Miss Banks announced that she would be contesting the seat of Flinders, held by Health Minister Greg Hunt. Mr. Hunt has held the seat since 2001 and won the last election on preference votes by 15%, and won 50% of the primary vote in that election. Ms. Banks, in a statement, specifically mentioned climate change and stated that her beliefs were sensible and centre. Ms. Banks has been a vocal critic of the government since the leadership spill which saw Malcolm Turnbull ousted of the Prime Minister's office, a vote where Greg Hunt did in fact vote for Peter Dutton. And lastly, in international news this week, we saw Australia follow suit with the US, announcing that Juan Guaido, the opposition leader and interim president of Venezuela, is the official interim president of Venezuela. In a statement, we saw Foreign Minister Maurice Payne call for a return to democracy in the South American nation, and shortly after we also saw the US implement sanctions on Venezuelan state-owned oil company PDVSA. National Security Advisor John Bolton announced that the sanctions will block $7 billion in assets and $11 billion in export proceeds over the next year. PDVSA is a massive source of revenue for the Venezuelan economy. Treasurer Steve Mnuchin stated that business in the US with PDVSA subsidiary Citgo will not be affected and would go into a blocked account. Nicolas Maduro stated that he would protect Citgo as it is PDVSA's property and property of the Venezuelan people. Also, we saw John Bolton did not specifically deny that there would be any military action in Venezuela, which also led to a lot of analysis of Mr. Bolton's notepad, which was facing towards the press briefing. And press took photos of it, which apparently it said in handwriting 5,000 troops to Colombia. So there will still be more to see in this, and as always, I have linked in the description below the full briefing with Steve Mnuchin and John Bolton, which you can see. It starts at about 1 minute 13, so watch from then on out, and you can see the full details of the sanctions, and also them answering questions from the press. And lastly, in international news this week, we saw a vote pass in the House of Commons by 15 votes to have Theresa May, the Prime Minister of the UK, go back to Brussels and renegotiate a legally binding Brexit deal. Miss May backed this vote, and another amendment also passed which rejected a no-deal exit from the EU, although this vote is not legally binding. Miss May will attempt to negotiate a deal which ensures that there is no hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, in order to ensure that people and goods which pass through both nations are not checked. 5 other amendments, including an attempt to delay Brexit, were not passed. To see more about these stories, check the description below. Be sure to like the video and subscribe, and comment what you thought about the past week in the political sphere. Also, check the description to see other stories which may gauge your interest, including President Trump calling out the intelligence community and potential peace in Afghanistan. Be sure to tune in next week.